Hello, everybody, and welcome to the June 14th, 2022 iteration of the Kubernetes SIG Windows community meeting. As always, these meetings are recorded and uploaded to YouTube, so be sure to adhere to the CNCF Code of Conduct. All right, let's get started with some announcements. First announcement is that enhancement freeze was delayed for a week. I think there's a lot of people who just felt there wasn't enough time to do all the reviews for this milestone due to delay of the previous release, KubeCon, everything. So the release team has decided to extend it until next Thursday. That's good. Next announcement is I will be on PTO starting next week for 2 weeks. So I think I'll talk to James and Jay and Claudia, and hopefully one of them can run the community meetings for those 2 weeks. Does anybody else have any announcements? Nope. Okay. Next, we'll give some space for anybody who's new to the call to say hi if they want. No pressure, but if anybody would like to either introduce themselves or say what they're working on, what they'd like to hope to work on, please feel free to either raise your hand or just speak. So we'll give a moment for that if anybody wants to. All right. I don't see anybody wanting to do that, so we can continue on with the agenda, which is mostly spillover from last week. Let's see. This first one is something that I added. I think we've mentioned this before in the past, but long story short is, because of the way we're building the pause image in the Kubernetes project, we're using BuildKit to build it on Linux machines. That method of doing so makes it so that we're unable to have registry changes during the build process kind of committed and stuck with that, which actually is limiting the flexibility of what we can do with the pause image. So what we've done, there's an issue describing more information about why we can't do that. But this PR here opens up, or we've actually made and published another intermediate image. It's getting published to MCR called the Windows Pause Image Base. And there's more information about where that gets built and what the Docker file looks like in this PR description and the other issue. But this is built on a Windows machine where we're able to commit changes to the registry. And this PR updates the pause image build in Kubernetes to use that base image. So we are able to more cleanly do things like disable the diagtrack service to get that performance back, and also setting some other registry keys to improve some of the behaviors around that. If anybody is interested in reviewing this PR, take a look. It actually has approvals from the owners of the pause image too, so it's ready to merge. I'm planning on merging this pretty soon. I don't know, I think, Claudio, you were interested in this too, if I remember correctly.
Yep, we'll take a look tomorrow and the purpose as well. The only thing that comes to mind, if that image has versions for all the Windows OS versions that we support for 1809 to 2022. That's the main concern. Yes. Okay.
And that other image is open source too, so anybody can submit pull requests to it, and then we can build another image. But yes, it's building 2019, 20H2, and LTSC 2022. And I've actually built and published the image with these scripts. I've got some references. Mm-hmm. And these the other images, they have notary signatures too. So moving forward, all of the container images that are published in the MCR are going to include notary signatures for build attestation. Cool. So yep, that's more of an FYI. I think that's all the discussions with the maintainers of pause image base have happened and they're okay with this approach. So it's just up to SIG Windows to be okay with it too. All right, anybody have any questions about that? If not, we can move on.
So did we add a Windows VM to the build cluster so that we can build on Windows machines?
We didn't. That was one of the approaches that was discussed in the issue. It was cleaner and let me the owners of the test infra were still not super on board with having their own Windows build machine. So one of this possible solutions was to use GitHub Actions to request a Windows Server build machine. But Microsoft had already had a process set up to build the images and publish to MCR, and the owners of that were okay with just consuming that image as long as the repository that hosted the Docker files and the build scripts was open to the public, so people could build it their own if they wanted to. So those conditions were all met. So we just decided to use the one that's getting published to MCR.
Makes sense. So the infrastructure is coming from MCR's infrastructure part.
Yes, to build that image.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. So if there's if anybody else decides or identifies any issues that we can do to help speed up like the performance of pod startup times, I think we're going to in a little bit. So folks at Microsoft are going to reevaluate that and see if we can trim down that image more to get the container startup times improved. Okay, next is this enhancement. James, did you want to give some background or talk about this? If not, maybe I can a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I can try to do this. I think this kind of ties into what the next issue as well. Yeah. So this kubeadm for Windows has been around. It's an enhancement that's been around for a few years now. And there was a ton of work by Kalia and Ben Moss, I think, to make this work. Mm-hmm. And I think initially kubeadm didn't work at all for Windows. And they did a bunch of work to make that happen. And now we actually use it in all of the cluster API stuff. And so it's pretty solid. There was a couple different implementations of this. Initially, there was some PowerShell scripts, and then there was another set of scripts and some Docker containers that enabled you to run Flannel and kubeproxy. Those used some limited, I guess, there were limitations, but they used them effectively to accomplish being able to spin up kubeproxy and Flannel as containers. As we moved into host process, a lot of that wasn't needed anymore. And I think the new approach with host process is a little bit cleaner of an approach. And so with that, we were looking at this proposal and trying to determine if, like, how do we take it forward and do we need to? And I think, we looked at kubeadm, and it doesn't actually require any changes from Windows side. And so I think the proposal here is to close down this kubeadm for Windows enhancement and just mark it as complete for now. I think so. I think that's kind of where we're at. But we wanted to bring it up in case anybody wanted to, jump in and say.
Yeah, James and I were talking about this a lot. As mentioned, a lot of the workarounds that are called out in here were required for Docker shim and to get networking set up with Docker shim. And since Docker shim is removed and the host process containers kind of address all of the issues we had running the CNIs and kubeproxy via daemon set, I'm not sure it makes a whole lot of sense to pursue this anymore. Everything kind of works, and recently all of the kubeadm enhancements that have went in especially around adaptation removal, have just been like people just do the work to have Windows work as well. So.
Yeah, and I think part of this as well is getting tests in place. And now that we have all of the cluster API tests running, we actually are testing kubeadm maybe even more extensively than we were prior with some of the older implementations of this. So.
Yeah, I think unless anybody objects, I think we'll probably just reach out to Lubomir and kind of also suggest this too and say, I think we're still interested in improving, like continuing to exercise and improve everything like kubeadm support for Windows, but I think we would either want to retroactively say this is already stable or just abandon this cap because everything has been functional for several releases now with continuity runtime. Is anybody else on the call using Cluster API or kubeadm to bootstrap Windows nodes? That would also be another good data point.
I think we use this for vSphere. CapV is using kubeadm and the Windows is joined with it.
Have you guys run into any issues? Did it just kind of work? Were you able to just address the issues, not part of a big enhancement? That's probably the case.
Yeah, this just works. Like we didn't see any issue with this procedure.
Yeah, that's been our experience too. If it's just working for most folks, I think that's more reasoning to kind of just close this cap down. It's very old and stale, and I think potentially misleading to people who stumble upon it too.
Yeah, I can comment this in the
okay. Yeah, so I think we probably should still loop in Lubomir, and then also maybe do a final round of cap updates explaining why we're closing it down and saying, things kind of work, and then link to examples, because these enhancement proposals do kind of stick around for posterity.
Okay,
that sounds like a good plan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if someone finds an issue, they should open GitHub issues against the individual cloud provider repos. Is that the goal?
I think it depends. I think that there are some cases where I'm trying, maybe James has some better ideas, but I know like one issue that came up was how to support if they should limit it so that all of the cloud providers and then the kubeadm infrastructure itself can support more than like the NetBIOS names for Windows, like longer names or not. So I think it depends. If for issues like that, there still is a kind of a desire to have consistency across all of the different cluster API providers and have a common behavior in kubeadm. But for other things, sometimes they're provider specific. Yes.
Yeah, and if you find a bug with kubeadm, lock it against kubeadm. I think it just depends on what kind of issue it is.
Yeah, I'm wondering what should we update in the enhancement or the GitHub issue while closing? Like, should we tell that if it's an issue with kubeadm, open GitHub issues against kubeadm, and if it's for other providers, these are the list of providers that are actually supported by or using kubeadm, and you should open issues against those repos.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I think we can ask Lubomir for some guidance on that too, who they probably deal with how to handle that for Linux too. Like if it's a issue for one provider versus a kind of generic piece of infrastructure issue. He might have more guidance. Okay, any other questions about that? Okay, real quick before we talk about the kube proxy image, I think, Nancy, did you add this item?
Yes, I did. So the thread for that is already open, and I just added it so I can get more attention to it. And
Yeah,
I think
Danny Cantor, who I mentioned, who I tagged in the thread, he's not on the call right now, is probably going to be able to resolve that the quickest. I recommend let's just reach out or wait for Danny to respond on that. He does a lot of dev work in the HCS shim repository, and he might just know what's wrong.
okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry about that, but I think Danny's going to be the best person to do that.
The other thing about those feature checks, there's been some changes in the latest versions of HCS shim to those for various reasons and things. So making sure you have the latest version of HCS shim for like library patched in for whatever you're using would help as well.
We are trying, but the thing is that we are using same HCS shim version in AWS as well as in Azure. Only Azure fails. That's what I'm little reluctant to move to the latest one, but still that's what we are going to try. I don't know, already we discussed about it. I don't know once we tried it yesterday or not. But the same version should not behave differently with Azure and AWS, right?
Theoretically, yes.
Yeah,
we are still going to try, but just I'm telling you.
I'd probably recommend there is I don't think HCS shim has a specific, I don't think they have releases, but they do cut tags. You might want to look, my recommendation is to look at whatever version or the tag of the HCS shim repository is getting vendored into the containerd 1.6 repository and try that one out. Because I know in Azure, we do pretty extensive testing of containerd 1.6 on Windows Server 2019 and 2022.
Okay, I'll take a look at that. I tried I think it's a 0.9 was the latest one on the shim repository. So I tried that locally and it did not help. So.
Okay, it looks like they're using 0.93 here. But if not, Danny's probably the person best suited to look at that.
Okay, thanks. I'll follow up.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. Sorry about that. James, did you want to?
Yeah. So kind of following up on the discussion with kubeadm and moving it forward. One of the things that kubeadm does right now is publishes it deploys kubeproxy after the fact, after it kind of initializes everything. It doesn't do that for Windows. So for Windows, you kind of need to provide kubeproxy image yourself or install kubeproxy manually on the host. And one of the things we did when we were trying out host process containers was make a kubeproxy container. And we did it for Flannel first, and then we did it for Calico. And I think there's several other implementations of this out there. And I was looking into, and Claudio actually helped out too. He kind of started to build a kubeproxy host process image that would be baked into the Kubernetes repository and build process. But it requires like PowerShell scripts. And right now, those PowerShell scripts are very dependent on, or can be very dependent on the particular CNI and the type of network that you're using, like underlying network that you're using. So I was going through trying to figure out how to get rid of those PowerShell scripts and figure out why we had the PowerShell scripts and what we didn't. So I wrote this document and it goes through and calls out some of the various workarounds that we have in the scripts. Some of them are things like waiting for the HNS network to come online. And I think this first was a workaround because QProxy, the Windows QProxy didn't wait for the HNS, but since then it's been resolved. And so I've linked to the like some examples of these custom scripts, as well as the fixes that are in QProxy today. The one that I wasn't able to resolve was the source VIP for if you're using VXLAN. And so Calico uses VXLAN as well as Flannel does, or at least you can use it with those. And what are the things that needs to happen for that source VIP that is passed into the kubelet is that it needs to be allocated via IPAM, and it doesn't necessarily need to be created.
Did you say passed into the kubelet?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. There's a flag that you pass. You just pass -- source VIP, and when you pass that and you pass the IP address, and that IP address has to be allocated in IPAM. Otherwise, QProxy will potentially could create that IP address, and then you'll have next time QProxy is going through and allocating IP addresses, you'll have two IP addresses stomp on top of each other. So it needs to be done through IPAM, and it's done differently for different CNIs. So Calico.
Can you explain that, James? So we send that to the kubelet, and when you say we allocate it through IPAM, you're saying when we enable Calico IPAM, I guess. Yeah, not so when we don't enable Calico IPAM. I see what you're saying.
There's two scenarios. So
yeah,
Flannel, and we've had this bug come up in Kubernetes a couple of times. With Flannel, Flannel doesn't really do anything when it starts up. It just kind of delegates everything off to the components, but you pass in this IP address that you want for your source VIP. QProxy looks and says, is this IP address already allocated? If not, I will create it. Now, QProxy doesn't have any knowledge of the IPAM that the CNI is using. And so it creates an endpoint in HNS. And later on, the CNI doesn't know about that because it hasn't been allocated in the IPAM that it's using. And it could create an IP address on top of the one that was allocated by QProxy. And so what we did in Flannel is we have in part of the startup script is that Flannel startup script will allocate the IP address in IPAM, but it doesn't actually create the endpoint. And then it lets QProxy create the endpoint. Now that means, next time Flannel's going to create IP addresses, it's already allocated out of the IPAM, and so it's not going to select
but it. Flannel isn't using Node IPAM normally?
Yeah, it uses host local or Node IPAM.
James, I think even in my previous IPAM implementation also, we always .2 or .3 on the subnet first will, even inside the IPAM, we will make sure that is always used for source VIP. It's kind of like a constant value.
Yeah, exactly.
We will pass it. Maybe I think Calico and the IPAM, what I implemented, we kind of had a similar role, like exactly like you said. So we pass that information so that IPAM will not use the IP in future. Any part when we create, it will go from .3 or 4 instead of using the first. Yeah, I remember this. Actually.
And then the first VIP is the first VIP is a VIP that tells everybody route to this node. The node owns that.
No, this has to do with the VXLAN. David might be able to answer that.
Okay.
A little bit more in detail, but it's so there's VIP in VXLAN is used in 3 different ways. It's used for the node SNATing, as well as for the service SNATing, is my understanding. And if you don't have that, then you potentially have packets not getting routed back, which shows weird network behavior.
Okay, so I'm a packet and I'm leaving a node, and when I'm leaving my node, my IP address needs to get changed from the pod IP that I started from to the source VIP.
That's my understanding.
And then that source VIP is like, go ahead.
No, it's like the VXLAN tunneling we call like VTUP. So when the encapsulation happens, I don't know whether that will be used there as a VTUP, and then encapsulate the packet and egress it out.
Okay. So the packet is leaving and you're encapsulating the packet in the source VIP.
Yeah, possible. Yeah, I forgot. It's been a while, but if it is for VXLAN, then generally there should be a VTEP IP which will kind of have that a packet inside a packet. Basically, we put the layer 3 packet inside another L2 packet, and the VTEP IP.
And the only thing I'm confused about is why the kubelet needs to know about this.
The kubeproxy.
Proxy.
Kubeproxy, that makes sense because you're leaving, you've got your IP address of the pod you're on, and before you leave, kubeproxy needs to SNAT you. But why would the kubelet need to know about this?
As
Kubelet doesn't.
Oh, earlier, James, you were saying kubelet. Maybe.
Oh, sorry.
Oh shit! I was okay. I was like, what? Why do you have to tell? Okay, all right, okay, okay, all right.
Sorry if I.
Okay, keep going. No, sorry, no more,
Yes.
no further questions, Your Honor. Okay.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so kubeproxy. So we have to give that IP address. So for Flannel, yeah, we say it's the .2 or .3 or something. In Calico, they do the IPAM, and I was seeing it come back as different IP addresses every time. And so either way, you need to kind of do this allocation up front and before kubeproxy starts. And there's no contract right now between like kubeproxy and the CNIs that says like, you need to create this IP address and you need to reserve it in IPAM, and then you need to give it to us as the source VIP. And so there's kind of this like confusion of like who does what responsibility, which makes it required to have these scripts upfront. And so what I'm proposing is just that we, if we say the CNI needs to create a well-known named endpoint, and then pass that name to kubeproxy, and well, it doesn't even need to pass the name because it'll be a well-known name. The kubeproxy can then look it up and say, if it's there, I'm going to use that as my source VIP because it's called source VIP endpoint or something. And if it's not, then it'll fall back to the old behavior, which is passing in that IP address. And so everything would be backwards compatible as it works. But this would allow us to get rid of all of those scripts. And in the document, I also link to like the Docker file. It makes the Docker file for kubeproxy really simple. And we just use the binary. We don't have any scripts. And this makes the configuration of kubeproxy really simple as well, because we can use all of the configuration instead of having to do all this startup script stuff.
So the proposal is that
this create an endpoint. The one you were saying the kubeproxy would expect an endpoint, right? Who would create and give it to kubeproxy?
That would be the CNI's responsibility to do that.
Then basically, it doesn't matter whether endpoint or the IP address, the CNI has to create, then it has to allocate a dedicated IP for that, and it has to pass it, right? It's same, at the end of the day, same. There's going to be one dedicated IP address.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just making it very clear that the responsibility is the CNI's responsibility instead of kind of this like, sure, CNI could do it, or kubeproxy could do it, or a combination of the two.
But what is
question is like, go ahead. I'll ask another question.
How are we sending information from a CNI to a kubeproxy in your proposal?
So right now, the way Calico does it is when Calico.
Yeah, they do everything and then they start the kubeproxy themselves.
Right.
But
Yeah.
Well, what are you suggesting?
Yes, same thing is kubeproxy sits there and waits for the HNS network. And until the HNS network is created, then it doesn't do anything else. And so we do essentially the same, like because we have that logic already there, when Calico creates the HNS endpoint, it creates a network, it creates that source VIP endpoint, HNS sees the network, looks for the endpoint and boots up.
Because the Calico PS1 already spins.
Yeah, and I want to take that out of the Calico PS1.
Got it.
Because
yeah. Oh, it's good. I'm glad you duct taped this whole story together. It seems really simple when you mention it, but it's like it's really weird to think. Okay, cool. Yeah. And then we'll see
that behavior where the kubeproxy waits. Could that have issues if like we're deploying kubeproxy through daemon set, if those containers get restarted or anything? Could it start up again? Query for HNS networks and say, okay, this is already configured and progress before we redo all of this stuff to.
That would be, it's all I'm doing is moving I'm proposing to move the logic that's in the script into kubeproxy. So it's this, like, it's just moving it up one layer so that we don't have the script anymore.
Yeah.
So if that problem already existed, then it would already be there. But we should probably look at that. That's a good call out as well.
Yeah, my 2 cents here is like, I agree. I think this is a good approach. Kubeproxy should not know about IPAM or manage these kind of things, and coupling them, even if in these scripts, is a very bad idea. So +1 for this.
Okay, that's
Yeah, this is great. This is great.
That coupling is what I'm trying to remove.
I like a kubeproxy init thing, and then maybe it's like we should have a, for backends in KPNG, maybe we should have a generic init that we add for other ones, because you know IPVS has to do something similar, right? IPVS has to make some fake device, the dummy device or whatever, and that's kind of hacked into the IPVS startup, as I recall. So this is a generic step that every service proxy, I think, needs to do. So yeah.
James, one question what I have is like, so if we are forcing IPAM to do that, like then the behavior between the Linux IPAM on the Linux side and the Windows side, is it going? It's going to be different, right? I don't think we enforce anything in the Linux side.
Yeah, I don't know if this is like this whole source VIP VXLAN thing isn't really a thing on the Linux side as far as I'm aware.
Well,
but that sounds like
this specifically isn't, but this generic problem of needing to bootstrap the kube proxy with like in IPVS, it's a dummy device that they need to create, because you're not allowed to create rules in IPVS unless they're associated with some device or something like that, right?
Does that answer your question, Alongo?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you just grep the kube proxy code, the Kubernetes code base for dummy, you'll see it in the IPVS setup.
Yeah, so please take a look at the document and review it and get feedback. But it sounds like generally this makes sense to folks. And if so, then I'll open up PR to get there, and then should make building the kubeproxy image easier, which is nice.
One question I have is how will we document this kind of expectation for other CNIs maybe? I mean, it should have probably been documented already beforehand.
Yeah.
But now we're here, right? So
yeah, I think as part of the PR we should, or I guess we can't do it in the same exact PR, but as part of that is we add it to the docs, and with the improvements that we made to the docs, we now have a SIG networking section, and we can add the existing behavior and this new behavior and expectation in those docs.
Should we add it to the Kubernetes.io, like the Windows page on the networking differences, maybe somewhere there?
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm thinking. We have that. We just did a reorganization of that, and there's this new Windows networking page that should be live actually, and we can add it there.
Okay, cool.
The other part of this is that the CNIs would need to adapt to create this new type of endpoint, or this named endpoint. So we'd have to communicate that with the CNIs as well.
And what will we do if, let's say, someone is able to update their kubeproxy, but they're using, like they want to use the kubeproxy daemon set with the updated logic, but they're using an older CNI binary, and they will not be using the script to create the source web.
Then they'll have to. I don't think they'll be able to use that new kubeproxy image. Or the other thing I had in there as a proposal, potential solution is using init containers. So we can have an init container that does this and then updates the config. And then the next container would start. but I haven't tested that, but that's a potential solution for that.
All right, okay.
Cool. Any other questions? All right. Well, we're 8 minutes over, so we'll wrap it up here and see everybody next week. See y'all.
See you.
Later.